Hey, in case you didn't know, this is a whole channel dedicated to going out of bounds. I always cover different games at all times, and one of the things that a lot of people were suggesting to me recently is a game I never even heard of called Poppy's Playtime. As someone who's always willing to go outside his own interests for the sake of the YouTube gaming community, I decided to check it out, and it's actually a really cool chapter-based game that we're unfortunately only stuck on chapter 1 right now, but I found some really interesting stuff out of bounds that I think you guys really need to check out here, especially if you're entrenched in the lore of Poppy Playtime. Like, for example, there's an unused element stored in the hallways when you first start the game, and this element that the developers stored underneath the boundaries is scribbled out portraits of the people that you're searching for in Poppy Playtime. Now, I had to use an additional tool set in order to boost the brightness so that you can actually see this, but these are photos of real life people with red and blue markers kind of masking their identities. And what's very clear to me is that the original intention of these portraits were to be hung up in these hallways between the toy room and the security room. And one of those portraits were supposed to be sitting on the hallway floor. Now, why it was removed, there's two very likely guesses. There's either A, it was a creative decision to take them out so it didn't feel as corny or on the nose with the story that the player has already been let in on up to this point. And another equally likely scenario is that perhaps the faces that were used for these portraits did not have the permission from either the photographer or the people depicted in them, and even though they're completely scratched out, the developers didn't want to risk any legal liability. If you ask me, I think it's more likely that it's the former rather than the latter. And then next up in this hallway, you might remember that there's a sign that says Stairway to Hell. Even though I tried to open this door at any given point during this chapter, you never can open the door to get to the stairwell. And normally in games, like this example here at the end of the chapter, if a door doesn't open, there's typically nothing on the other side. But surprisingly, there is a staircase on the opposite side. Now, it's not lit at all, and I had to use a lot of lighting hacks just to make something visible for you, the viewer at home. But the original geometry of this staircase was to have a part that's just broken, making it so that your character falls and probably gets hurt. But the staircase is really winding and long, and so I also imagine this is probably cut for whatever reason, either because it might convince players that this is the right way to go when it's not, or the player might be able to survive the fall and then they're stuck down there because there's no way back up. Now here's two unused pieces of content here. Right outside where you start the game, there's a modeling of the exterior of the Playtime company, and this goes completely unseen by the player. It may have been at one point that the player was supposed to start from the outside of the game and walk inside, but that's certainly not the case now. And there's an outline for a dev cube right by one of the doors, possibly backing up this theory, or having a different purpose entirely. In fact, that's not the only time that there's exterior modeling in the game. During this part where you're trying to get the right hand, if you take the camera outside of these windows, you can see how the building is uniquely modeled on the outside. Alright, now I'm going to take a second to talk about today's sponsor, Trove. Trove is a voxel action MMO that allows you to express your creativity while also having a really robust action RPG combat system. The game includes 17 classes, which for me, I chose Boomeranger. I always feel like I have more control in an action RPG when I'm a ranged fighter. And you can explore open maps, go through dungeons, and even experience user-generated content. One thing I will tell you genuinely from my experience, for a free-to-play game, the controls and customization don't feel cheap in any sense. This is a game that clearly has a lot of work put into it. Like, I was surprised to see how many players had mounts and custom costumes and things like that. So I genuinely feel pretty good about telling you guys, go check it out. I mean, if you're a kid with no source of income, it's free to play. Or if you're someone my age, honestly, it looks like there's a lot here in terms of gameplay. And I think you might find yourself pretty impressed. But anyways, I have a link available down below, but you can get it on PC, PS4, PS5, all modern Xbox consoles, and Nintendo Switch. And thanks again, Gamigo Group, for letting me talk about your game Trove. And here's something a lot of you probably wasn't expecting. All the menus for Poppy Playtime exist in a 3D space as well. Now it all acts as HUD, so you can't manipulate the camera for these images, but if you disable the HUD, you can then see what's truly behind it, which is just the black void of a gray flat square. And if we were to keep the HUD removed and just start the game, you can see that this gray square is in fact placed right where you first see Huggy, which seems to be a central hub that never ever goes away. I've noticed that no matter what part of the chapter I'm at, this central area is always loaded in. And I guess very briefly, I'll also talk about the fact that all the lighting in this area took a little bit of work on the developers. By taking the camera outside of it, you can see how they blocked light from reaching inside the building in certain areas by using developer geometry that's only modeled on one side. And by taking the camera back inside the dome, you can see how it affects the lighting. Now that light effect only bleeds through this window and not incidentally the other one. Anyways, when you get the second hand, there's a couple things to talk about here. One is this unused object over here, which may have been a beta element for how the hand was stored, as it looks like there's a lock on it and a box of glass similar to the box of glass that's used for the second hand. And also, oddly enough, when the hand drops from the crane and lands on the conveyor belt, another red hand gets stored underneath the boundaries. And some of you may think, well, one's a prop hand, the other one is just the hand that the character actually grabs and uses, which no, at no point does that hand that gets stored underneath the boundaries ever go away. Also, fun little fact here, the cassette tapes that you put into the VHS players do actually have the VHS tapes inside, so you can take comfort in knowing that your immersion is not broken here. The VHS player is actually housing the VHS tape. And now let's quickly talk about the first time you see Huggy. Surprisingly, the one that you would think is the killer Huggy does not have the killer teeth inside of his body. And some of you might think, well, when it's friendly looking, it's not going to have the teeth. And very quickly, I'm going to show you a contrary to that, because a couple of the Huggies that are still in their packaging do in fact have the killer teeth that ends up pursuing you later. And now we're just going to talk about Huggy for a good minute here. So you know when you turn on the electricity and you turn around, you see that Huggy's gone? Well, this is what it looks like when you activate the electricity. He just immediately disappears. And you can even see the dev cube that has the coding to trigger that event. Also, fun little fact, you can see that yourself just as long as you keep your sight on the hub area. And then the first inkling that Huggy has come alive is over here where he has his hand outside the door. Taking the camera over there before you can get him to move his hand away can show you that his entire model is there and that the rest of him is in a T pose. Also, it should be noted that the Huggy you use here is in fact the killer Huggy, not the friendly Huggy. And then when you collect all the cubes to try to go get the second hand, Huggy is hanging out on one of the conveyor belts. And once again, fun little fact, if you keep your eye on that spot as you're going through this doorway, you can see him pop into existence. But that's besides the point. What I wanted to show you is what the body looks like while he's in this pose. And it's all contorted, and once again, one of his limbs is just kind of sticking outside of the vent. And when you trigger the animation where the hatch door closes, you can see that his neck extends for some reason. Also, some people want to know what it looked like when Huggy kills you. So I don't mean to keep barraging you with fun little facts, but did you know that when you trigger the first pursuance scene, he can't actually kill you yet. He has to push you outside the hallway first. And then once you're outside the hallway, I can show you in this exact moment exactly what it looks like when he gets a hold of you. And no, I didn't freeze the game here. This is how the game looks behind the HUD that tells you, to start over or whatever before you start a new scene. Again, this is what it looks like when Huggy gets you. Also, that archway is completely pitch black. You can actually see that he's not waiting there the entire time. Instead, he's spawned in. And then that final sequence when you're going through all sorts of different tubes. Oh my goodness, there is so much to talk about here. And it turns out there are like 4 to 5 Huggies all in existence at once. And that all the different ways in which you can die in these tunnels have their own separate Huggy that is waiting to start their animation. It's really cool to see. In fact, here's one angle in which you can see 2 Huggies at once. And you might remember this animation here where Huggy's going through the vents but can't quite reach you yet. Here's where he starts and here's where he goes. You can see that once his animation is done, the model deloads. And of course, at the end of all of this, you take down Huggy and his body falls down this silo. And I'm really happy to report that this version of Huggy never deloads. So he always hangs outside the white void in a really goofy pose. And then this is just completely bizarre. I don't even know what to make of this, but once you activate all the machines, outside the boundaries there's an object that is revolving in a big wide circular pattern at a speed that is so fast that it's really tough to see what the heck it even is. So at this point, I froze the camera and I went up to it to see what the heck is going on here. And for whatever reason, there is a metal pipe that circles over the entire map. Here's a great angle in which you can see it dive bombing into the hub area where you first meet Huggy. And as far as what's actually going on behind the camera when you're in first person, all you have is the gun hands. There's no one operating the trigger or anything like that. And once again, if you mess with the game enough, you can see the entire gun on your own. But this is what it looks like when you're walking around and when you're firing the tool off. And here's something really cool. In the archways where you can see the boxes going on the conveyor belts in the background of the build-a-toy area, you can see that the developers accidentally left in the labeled trigger to spawn the box. And so the trigger is labeled as box track. And lastly, Poppy herself has something to talk about. Taking the camera underneath the doll's dress can show you that there are fully modeled legs as well as red shoes, which is very surprising unless you consider the fact that this model is going to be used for chapter 2 and onward, and there might be a reason to have them. Have a Five Nights at Freddy's video or a Bendy and the Ink Machine video if you're interested in either one of those. Same idea, just taking everything out of bounds, getting pretty close to 1 million subscribers. It would mean a lot if you hit subscribe too. Anyways, take it easy.